What you're about to hear today is a story that will shake you to your core in ways you never imagined possible. It's about one of Hollywood's most beloved actors, Timothée Chalamet, and 3 days that changed his life forever. 3 days he's never been able to properly explain to anyone, even to this day, and what he saw in that forest. Well, you'll understand why it haunts him even now. But before we begin this disturbing journey, tell me in the comments, do you believe there are places in this world that serve as portals to other dimensions? Because after hearing this story, I guarantee you'll rethink everything you thought you knew about reality. And trust me, by the end of this narrative you'll understand why some stories should never be told, yet must be shared to prevent others from making the same terrifying mistake. It was October 2023. Timothée was filming his latest project in a small town in rural Oregon, United States, an independent film, far from the Hollywood spotlight, something he'd always loved doing to reconnect with the pure art of acting. The town was called Millbrook, one of those places with fewer than 3,000 residents, surrounded by dense, ancient forests where trees had been growing for over 200 years. But these weren't ordinary trees, and this wasn't an ordinary forest, as Timothée would soon discover in the most horrifying way possible. The actor was staying at a rustic inn in the town center, a cozy but simple place called the Millbrook Lodge. Very different from the luxury hotels he was used to, and that was exactly what he wanted. A break from the hectic life, a moment to breathe and connect with something deeper. Little did he know that this desire for connection would lead him to make contact with forces that exist beyond human comprehension. Entities that had been waiting centuries for someone exactly like him. The innkeeper, a weathered man in his 60s named Frank, welcomed Timothée with the kind of forced smile that locals reserve for outsiders. Frank had been running the lodge for 37 years, and in all that time, he'd learned to spot the ones who would be drawn to the forest. There was something in their eyes, he later told investigators, a hunger for experiences that went beyond the ordinary. Timothée had that look from the moment he walked through the door. During the first few days of filming, Timothée noticed something peculiar about that forest surrounding Millbrook. The locals avoided talking about it, but their avoidance wasn't casual or coincidental. It was deliberate, coordinated, as if the entire town had agreed to maintain a conspiracy of silence. When he asked about hiking trails or beautiful places to visit, people would quickly change the subject or give vague answers. Better to stick around town, they'd say, their eyes darting nervously toward the tree line. The forest isn't a place for tourists. But there were other signs, subtle indicators that something was deeply wrong with that stretch of wilderness. Dogs refused to go near the forest's edge, whimpering and backing away when their owners tried to walk them in that direction. Birds would fly in wide arcs around the trees, never landing on the branches or nesting in the ancient trunks. Even insects seemed to avoid the area, creating an unnatural dead zone where life simply refused to flourish. The local newspaper, a small weekly publication called the Millbrook Gazette, had no stories about the forest despite it covering nearly 60% of the land around town. No hiking features, no nature photography, no environmental pieces about conservation. It was as if the forest simply didn't exist in the collective consciousness of the community, a massive blind spot in the town's awareness. But you know Timothée, right? He's always been a curious person, introspective, someone who seeks authentic experiences and isn't satisfied with surface-level explanations. The more people avoided talking about the forest, the more intrigued he became. And it was this curiosity, this insatiable hunger for deeper truth, that sealed his fate and set him on a path toward experiences that would fundamentally alter his understanding of reality. During the first week of filming, he met Margaret, an 82-year-old woman who worked at the town's only bookstore, a cramped little place called Pages and Portals that specialized in local history and what she euphemistically called alternative spirituality. Margaret was different from the other residents in ways that went far beyond her willingness to discuss the forest. She had an otherworldly quality about her, as if she existed partially in this reality and partially somewhere else entirely. When Timothée mentioned the forest, she didn't look away like the others. Instead, she stared at him with an intensity he later described as disturbing, her pale blue eyes seeming to look not at him but through him, examining something invisible to ordinary perception. "You feel something when you look at those trees, don't you?" she asked him, with a raspy voice worn by decades of cigarettes and secrets that shouldn't be spoken aloud. "I can see it in your eyes, in your aura. You're drawn to it. The forest has already marked you as one of its own." Timothée felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the October air. How could this stranger read him so easily? He'd been feeling exactly that, an inexplicable pull toward those dark woods every time he looked out his hotel window. It was as if something was calling him, whispering his name in a language he couldn't understand but somehow recognized deep in his genetic memory. The sensation had been growing stronger each day. He'd find himself standing at his window for hours, staring into the depths of the forest, feeling as though invisible threads were slowly wrapping around his consciousness and drawing him inexorably toward something he couldn't identify but desperately needed to find. "What's in there?" he asked Margaret, leaning closer across the bookstore counter, breathing in the scent of old paper and something else. something organic and ancient that seemed to emanate from the woman herself. The old woman's pale blue eyes seemed to pierce right through him, seeing layers of his being that he wasn't even aware existed. "Things that shouldn't exist," she whispered, her voice taking on a quality that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her physical throat. "Things that have been waiting for someone like you. Someone sensitive, someone who can see beyond the veil that separates our world from theirs. Someone who carries the genetic markers that make interdimensional contact possible." Margaret told to him about the history of Millbrook, how the town had been built on land that indigenous tribes had considered sacred and cursed. She spoke of disappearances dating back to the 1800s, of people who ventured into the forest and came back fundamentally changed, if they came back at all. Their families would report that their loved ones looked the same but were different in ways that couldn't be quantified or explained. The disappearances followed a pattern, she explained. They always involved individuals with certain psychological profiles: artists, writers, musicians, actors, people whose minds were naturally attuned to accessing altered states of consciousness. The forest seemed to call specifically to those who lived their lives exploring the boundaries between reality and imagination. "But why are you telling me this?" Timothy asked, his actor's instincts picking up on the deliberate nature of this conversation, the sense that every word had been carefully chosen for maximum impact. "Because you're going to go in there anyway," Margaret said with a sad smile that spoke of decades of watching the same pattern repeat itself. "I can see it in your aura, in the way the shadows bend around you when you're not looking. You're already marked. The forest has chosen you, and once you've been chosen, resistance is futile. The only question is whether you'll go willingly or be compelled." She pulled out a leather-bound journal from beneath the counter, its pages yellowed with age and filled with handwriting in multiple languages and scripts. "This contains accounts from everyone who's gone into that forest and managed to return with their sanity intact," she said, placing it before him. "Read it. Understand what you're about to face. And when you come back, if you come back, add your story to the others." That night, Timothy couldn't sleep. He stood at his hotel window, staring at the tree line that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, like a massive heart beating just beneath the surface of reality. The rational part of his mind told him Margaret was just a crazy old woman spinning local legends designed to scare tourists. But something deeper, something primal that existed in the reptilian core of his brain, recognized the truth in her words. He opened Margaret's journal and began to read. The first entry was dated 1847, written in fading ink by someone named Jeremiah Collins, a traveling minister who had become lost in the forest for 5 days. His account spoke of walking through landscapes that obeyed different laws of physics, of encountering beings that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, of learning truths about the nature of reality that human language was inadequate to express. The entries continued chronologically, each one adding layers to a picture of something vast and incomprehensible lurking just beyond the edge of human perception. A railroad surveyor in 1892 who described walking through a section of forest where time moved backward. A photographer in 1923 who claimed to have captured images of creatures that didn't appear on film until weeks later, as if they existed in a temporal state slightly offset from our own. More recent entries were even more disturbing. A graduate student in 1987 who wrote about being guided through the forest by entities that communicated through direct consciousness transfer, downloading information about the true nature of the universe directly into his mind. A nature documentary filmmaker in 2003 who described filming footage that showed entirely different scenes when played back, as if the camera had recorded events happening in parallel dimensions. Are you guys feeling that same chill right now? Because I'm getting goosebumps just telling you this story. And I have a feeling that something is watching me as I speak these words. Let me know in the comments if you're experiencing anything unusual while listening to this strange sounds. Movements in your peripheral vision, or that overwhelming sense of being observed by something that doesn't belong in our reality. The next morning, during a break in filming, Timothy approached the forest's edge with Margaret's journal tucked under his arm. He told himself he was just going for a quick walk, maybe find some inspiration for his character, but deep down he knew he was lying to himself. The pull had become irresistible, a gravitational force that seemed to emanate from the very core of the forest. The moment his feet crossed the invisible boundary between the town and the wilderness, everything changed in ways that his mind still struggles to process. The sounds of Millbrook cars, construction, people talking, even the ambient electrical hum of modern civilization disappeared instantly, as if someone had pressed a mute button on the entire world. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, creating a silence so profound that it felt oppressive, unnatural. But it wasn't just the absence of sound that disturbed him. The quality of light itself seemed different, taking on a silvery, otherworldly quality that made familiar objects appear alien and threatening. The air felt thicker, almost viscous, as if he was breathing liquid instead of gas. Each step required more effort than it should have, as if the forest was actively resisting his presence while simultaneously drawing him deeper into its embrace. The trees were massive, their trunks so wide that it would take 6 people holding hands to encircle them. But it wasn't their size that unnerved him, it was the way they seemed to lean inward, creating a canopy so dense that even at midday, the forest floor was shrouded in perpetual twilight. The bark had an unusual texture, almost scaly, and when he touched one of the ancient trunks, it felt warm and slightly soft, more like skin than wood. Worse still were the patterns carved into many of the trees, symbols and designs that hurt his eyes to look at directly, as if they were somehow too complex for human visual processing to handle. The carvings seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them, rearranging themselves into new configurations that suggested meanings just beyond his comprehension. Timothy walked for what felt like hours, following paths that appeared and disappeared with no apparent logic. Though when he checked his phone, only 20 minutes had passed. That's when he noticed his phone had no signal, which wasn't unusual in remote areas, but the time display was flickering between different numbers, as if reality itself was glitching and his device was struggling to maintain its connection to linear time. The GPS function showed his location as impossible coordinates, placing him simultaneously in Oregon, the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and somewhere in what appeared to be deep space. The compass spun wildly before settling on magnetic north directions that changed every few seconds, as if the fundamental laws of physics were optional in this place. He was about to turn back when he saw it, a path that definitely hadn't been there moments before. It was perfectly straight, cutting through the forest like a surgeon's incision, lined with stones that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The stones were arranged in patterns that reminded him of astronomical charts, mapping constellations he didn't recognize in configurations that suggested a completely different night sky. Every instinct told him to run. Every fiber of his being screamed that this was wrong, unnatural, dangerous. But something stronger than fear compelled him forward, something that felt like invisible hands gently pushing him along that impossible path. His legs moved of their own accord, carrying him deeper into a realm where the rules of ordinary reality held no power. The deeper he went, the more the forest changed around him in ways that his mind still refuses to fully accept. The trees, they began to twist into impossible shapes, their branches forming geometric patterns that existed in more than 3 dimensions, creating optical illusions that made his eyes water and his head spin. The air itself seemed to thicken further, taking on a quality that made breathing feel like swallowing liquid mercury. And then he heard them: voices, whispers, conversations in languages that predated human civilization by millions of years. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the twisted trees and reverberating through his bones, speaking in harmonies that suggested communication methods far more sophisticated than mere words. Timothée, they called, and hearing his name spoken by entities that shouldn't know of his existence sent waves of terror and fascination coursing through his nervous system. "We've been waiting for you. We've been preparing for your arrival, since before your species learned to make fire." He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't obey the desperate commands from his rational mind. He wanted to scream, but his voice had abandoned him, stolen away by forces that operated according to rules he couldn't understand. All he could do was keep walking along that luminous path, deeper into a realm that existed in the spaces between what is and what should never be. Hours passed, or maybe days, or perhaps centuries. Time had no meaning in that place, becoming as fluid and malleable as everything else. Timothy witnessed things that his mind still refuses to fully process, experiences so far beyond human comprehension that even now, years later, he can only remember fragments, scattered images that surface in his dreams and nightmares. He saw creatures that belonged in the deepest, most primal nightmares of humanity's collective unconscious, beings of shadow and light that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, their forms constantly shifting between states of matter that had no names in any human language. Some appeared almost familiar, like distorted reflections of earthly animals, while others were so alien that looking at them directly caused physical pain. He walked through clearings where gravity worked sideways, where trees grew downward into the sky and their roots hung in the air like grasping fingers. He witnessed sunsets that painted the sky in colors that don't exist in our spectrum of reality, hues that his brain interpreted as emotions rather than visual experiences. In one particularly vivid memory, he found himself standing in a vast library where the books were made of crystallized thoughts, their pages turning themselves as they absorbed knowledge directly from his mind. The librarian was a being that appeared to be constructed entirely of geometric shapes arranged in patterns that suggested consciousness without requiring any recognizable form of life. But the most terrifying part wasn't what he saw, it was what he felt, a presence, ancient and vast beyond human comprehension, that seemed to be studying him with the detached curiosity of a scientist examining an interesting specimen. He could feel it probing the depths of his consciousness, learning from him, taking pieces of his essence and replacing them with something else, something that belonged to its realm rather than his. The presence communicated without words, downloading information directly into his consciousness at speeds that overwhelmed his ability to process. He learned about the true structure of reality, about the infinite dimensions that exist parallel to our own, about the role that certain human beings play as bridges between worlds. Guys, I need to pause here for a moment because even as I'm telling you this, I can feel something watching me, something that doesn't belong in our reality but has been drawn here by the telling of this story. Can you feel it too? That sensation of being observed by something vast and ancient and utterly alien. Drop a comment if you're experiencing anything unusual right now, because according to the information I'm about to share, simply hearing this account can sometimes create temporary connections to that other realm. On the second day, though, day and night had no meaning in that twisted realm where the sun never quite seemed to set, but darkness never completely fell. Timothée encountered what he could only describe as the Guardian. It was a figure that constantly shifted between human and something else entirely, its face a kaleidoscope of every person who had ever disappeared in those woods, their features blending and separating in patterns that suggested some form of collective consciousness. The Guardian stood at the center of a clearing that existed in a state of temporal flux, where past, present, and future occurred simultaneously. Timothée could see multiple versions of the same trees at different stages of growth and decay, existing in the same space but in different temporal states. The effect was nauseating and beautiful, like watching the entire life cycle of the forest compressed into a single moment. "You don't belong here," the Guardian said, its voice like the sound of autumn leaves mixed with children's laughter and the distant roar of cosmic winds. "But you were called, and so you must choose. The forest has marked you as one of its own, but the final decision of whether to accept that marking remains yours. Choose what." Timothée managed to whisper, his voice barely audible in the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to absorb sound before it could properly form. "To stay and become one of us, joining the collective consciousness that spans multiple dimensions, or to leave and carry our mark forever, serving as a bridge between your world and ours. Either way, you'll never be the same. The person who entered this forest 3 days ago has already ceased to exist." The Guardian showed him visions of his possible futures, images that appeared directly in his mind without passing through his eyes. In one, he remained in the forest, becoming another whisper in the wind, another story told by crazy old women in bookstores. His consciousness absorbed into the vast network of entities that inhabited the interdimensional spaces. In this future, he retained his individual awareness but became part of something larger, gaining access to knowledge and experiences that spanned eons and dimensions. He could see the birth and death of stars, witness the evolution of consciousness across countless worlds, understand the fundamental forces that shaped reality at its deepest levels. In the other future, he returned to his world but as something fundamentally changed, forever sensitive to things that others couldn't see or hear. He would carry within him a piece of the forest's consciousness, serving as an ambassador between dimensions, helping to prepare humanity for the eventual convergence of realities that was approaching with each passing year. "I want to go home," he said, though part of him, a part that was growing stronger by the hour, wanted to stay in that place where reality was fluid and anything was possible, where the limitations of human existence could be transcended. The Guardian smiled with a mouth full of starlight, its expression containing emotions that human language had no words to describe. Home is a relative concept when you exist across multiple dimensions simultaneously. But very well, you've been chosen as our messenger, our herald of the changes that are coming. Go back to your world and tell them we're still here. Tell them we're waiting, and that the time of convergence approaches." The Guardian explained that throughout human history, certain individuals had served this role, channeling influence into their creative work. Artists, writers, musicians, and actors who had made contact with the forest entities and returned to serve as unconscious ambassadors, gradually preparing human consciousness for the eventual revelation of the larger multiverse. "Your species stands at a crossroads," the Guardian continued, its form shifting between human and something that resembled a constellation of living light. "You're developing the technology to detect our presence, to prove scientifically what shamans and mystics have always known. The age of dimensional isolation is ending, and when it does, those who have been prepared will serve as guides for the rest of humanity." The third day was the worst, a journey through landscapes that existed in states of perpetual transformation. As the Guardian led him back through the impossible geography of the interdimensional realm, Timothée felt pieces of the forest attaching themselves to his soul, taking up permanent residence in the corners of his consciousness. He could feel otherworldly entities downloading themselves into his mind, not as invasive parasites but as willing symbionts, sharing their knowledge and perspectives while learning from his human experiences. Each entity brought with it memories of civilizations that had risen and fallen on worlds he'd never heard of, technologies that operated on principles that human science hadn't discovered, art forms that existed in dimensions beyond human perception. The process was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. He could feel his consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of his individual human identity, gaining access to a network of intelligence that spanned galaxies and dimensions. But he could also feel himself losing some essential aspect of his humanity, becoming something that existed between worlds rather than fully belonging to either. When he finally emerged from the forest, stumbling back into Millbrook like a man awakening from a fever dream that had lasted lifetimes. 3 days had passed in the real world. The film crew had called the police. Search parties had been organized, with dogs and helicopters, and his agent had flown in from Los Angeles in a panic, already dealing with media inquiries about the missing star. But here's the thing that will give you chills and make you question everything you think you know about the nature of time and consciousness. To Timothy, it felt like he'd been gone for months, possibly years. He had memories of conversations with beings of pure thought that had lasted for decades, of walking through cities that existed in the spaces between seconds, of learning the true names of stars that had died before Earth was born. His phone, when he finally turned it on, showed thousands of missed calls and messages, but also something else that the investigators never included in their reports. The device had somehow recorded hours of audio and video footage during his disappearance, despite having no battery power when he entered the forest. The recordings showed nothing but static and white noise. But when analyzed with sophisticated audio equipment, they revealed voices speaking in languages that didn't match any known human communication system. The official story was that he'd gotten lost while hiking and had suffered from exposure and dehydration, experiencing hallucinations brought on by stress and lack of food and water. The media bought it. The insurance companies were satisfied, and filming resumed after a brief delay. But those closest to Timothy knew something fundamental had changed in ways that went far beyond the obvious physical effects of his ordeal. His co-stars noticed it first. During the remaining weeks of filming, during emotional scenes, his eyes would occasionally focus on something just beyond the camera, as if he was seeing things that weren't there or responding to direction from sources that no one else could perceive. His method acting, always intense, became almost supernatural in its authenticity, accessing emotions and experiences that seemed to come from somewhere beyond normal human understanding. Sarah Chen, his co-star in the film, later described his performance as otherworldly, saying that watching him work was like observing someone channeling experiences from multiple lifetimes simultaneously. He wasn't just acting, she told friends, he was accessing something deeper, more primal than normal human emotion. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. The director Marcus Rodriguez initially attributed the change to the stress of the disappearance. But as filming continued, he began to suspect something more profound had occurred. Tim's performance took on qualities that I'd never seen before. He explained years later, he could convey complex emotional states that seemed to exist outside normal human experience. It was as if he'd gained access to a broader spectrum of consciousness. But the real changes were more subtle and far more disturbing than anything that showed up on camera. Timothy began to see things, glimpses of that other realm, bleeding through into our reality in ways that suggested the boundaries between dimensions were far more permeable than most people realized. He'd catch sight of shadow figures in his peripheral vision, beings that existed in a state of partial visibility, neither fully in our dimension nor completely absent from it. He'd hear whispers in empty rooms, conversations in those otherworldly languages that seemed to carry on regardless of whether anyone was listening. Most unsettling of all, he'd feel the presence of the forest even when he was on the other side of the country, as if distance had no meaning when it came to interdimensional connections. I want you to pause right now and look around your room, because what I'm about to tell you next might cause you to experience some of these phenomena yourself. According to what Timothy later told his closest friends and family members, reading about or even hearing about his experience can sometimes create a temporary connection to that other realm, opening doorways in consciousness that normally remain closed. Let me know in the comments if you're noticing anything unusual, strange sounds, movements in the shadows, or that overwhelming sense of being watched by something that doesn't belong in our reality. Margaret, the old woman from the bookstore, they visited him on his last day in Millbrook, appearing at his hotel room door without having been invited or announced. She looked at him with those pale blue eyes that seemed to see through multiple layers of reality simultaneously and nodded knowingly, as if confirming something she'd suspected all along. "You've seen the truth now," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested she was speaking from more than one dimensional state at the same time. "The forest has made you one of its ambassadors. You'll spend the rest of your life helping others understand that our world is just one layer of a much larger, much stranger reality." She handed him a small object, something that looked like a piece of crystallized light that seemed to contain entire galaxies within its structure. "This will help you remember," she said. "When the rational part of your mind tries to convince you that it was all hallucination, this will remind you of the truth you've experienced." The object was warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm like a heart made of compressed starlight. When he held it, Timothy could feel his consciousness briefly expanding again, touching the edges of that vast network of intelligence he'd encountered in the forest. "What am I supposed to do with this knowledge?" he asked, feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility of carrying interdimensional secrets. "Share it," Margaret replied. "Not directly, that would cause panic and be dismissed as fantasy, but through your work, through your performances, through the emotional truths you convey to audiences. plant seeds of expanded awareness that will help prepare humanity for what's coming. When Timothy returned to Los Angeles, he tried to resume his normal life, but normal was no longer a concept that applied to his existence. He'd been fundamentally altered by his experience, rewired at a molecular level to perceive reality differently than other human beings. His apartment, which had always been a sanctuary, now felt confining and artificial. He could see the walls of consensus reality pressing in around him, limiting his perception to a narrow band of what was actually there. Sometimes, late at night, he'd catch glimpses of the true structure of his living space, seeing the multiple dimensional layers that existed in the same location, each one occupied by different forms of consciousness. His dreams became incredibly vivid and complex, featuring landscapes and beings from the interdimensional realm he'd visited. But these weren't ordinary dreams. They felt more like meetings, conferences where he'd receive instructions and information from the entities he'd encountered in the forest. Through these dream communications, he learned about the larger pattern of which his experience was just one small part. Throughout human history, there had been individuals who served as interdimensional ambassadors, channeling otherworldly influence into human culture and gradually preparing the species for eventual contact with non-human intelligence. Many of the greatest artists, writers, musicians, and performers in human history had undergone similar experiences. Though most were unaware of the larger purpose their work served, they simply knew that their creativity had taken on new depths and meanings that they couldn't fully explain. Accessing inspiration from sources that seemed to exist beyond normal human consciousness, he began to research similar cases, reaching out to other people who'd had encounters with interdimensional phenomena. What he discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. There are places all over the world like that forest in Oregon. Thin spots where the barrier between dimensions is permeable and contact with otherworldly entities is possible. These locations often share similar characteristics: ancient forests, certain mountain ranges, isolated desert regions, and specific urban areas where unusual electromagnetic phenomena have been recorded. They're places where reality becomes fluid, where the normal rules of physics and consciousness break down and allow for experiences that transcend ordinary human perception. The scientific community, of course, dismissed his experiences as hallucinations brought on by stress and isolation, but Timothy knew better. He'd touched something beyond the veil of ordinary reality, and it had touched him back, leaving permanent changes in his consciousness that couldn't be explained by conventional psychology or neuroscience. More disturbing was his growing realization that these dismissals weren't entirely accidental. There seemed to be organized efforts to suppress information about interdimensional contact, government agencies and private organizations working to maintain the illusion that our reality is the only one that exists. His acting career continued to flourish, but those who worked with him noticed profound changes in his approach to performance. His portrayals became more nuanced and emotionally complex, as if he was drawing from a well of experience that extended far beyond his years on Earth. Directors spoke of his ability to convey emotions that seemed to come from another realm entirely, accessing states of consciousness that other actors couldn't reach. Critics began using words like transcendent and otherworldly to describe his performances, never knowing how literally accurate those descriptions were. But success came with a price that went far beyond the usual pressures of fame. Timothy began to attract attention from individuals and organizations that most people don't know. Exist government agencies that investigate paranormal phenomena, secret societies that study interdimensional contact, researchers who spend their lives documenting encounters with entities from other realms. Some of these individuals reached out to him directly, claiming to represent organizations with names like the Institute for Dimensional Studies and the Department of Anomalous Phenomena. They wanted to study him, to understand how he'd survived 3 days in a place that typically doesn't release its visitors unchanged. They wanted to know what he'd learned, what he'd seen, what knowledge he'd brought back from the other side. The approaches were always subtle, professional, couched in language that could be dismissed as legitimate scientific or academic interest. But Timothy's enhanced sensitivity allowed him to perceive the true nature of these contacts, the agenda that lay beneath the surface: friendliness. Some of these individuals were genuinely benevolent, part of networks of researchers who were legitimately interested in advancing human understanding of the universe's true nature. They shared information about other contact cases, about the gradual process of preparing humanity for broader awareness of interdimensional reality. But others had darker intentions, representing interests that sought to weaponize interdimensional contact or exploit the knowledge for personal gain. They viewed people like Timothy as resources to be utilized, sources of information about technologies and capabilities that could provide massive advantages to whoever controlled them. Learning to distinguish between these different types of contact became a crucial survival skill. Timothy developed an almost supernatural ability to read the intentions of people he met, sensing the motivations that lay beneath their words and actions. This enhanced empathy became one of the most valuable assets he gained from his forest experience. He found himself living a double life, the public face of a successful actor and the private reality of someone who'd become a bridge between worlds. He learned to be careful about what he shared and with whom, understanding that knowledge of the interdimensional realm could be dangerous in the wrong hands. The whispers from the forest never stopped. Even now, years later, he can hear them calling to him, inviting him to return to that realm where reality is fluid and consciousness can expand beyond the boundaries of individual identity. Sometimes, late at night in his Los Angeles home, he'll catch glimpses of that luminous path appearing in his peripheral vision, tempting him to step through and abandon this reality entirely. The temptation is real and growing stronger. The entities he encountered in the forest continued to communicate with him through dreams and meditation, sharing information about the approaching convergence of dimensions that will forever change the nature of human existence. Friends close to Timothée say he's changed in ways that go beyond the obvious transformation in his acting abilities. His empathy has deepened to an almost supernatural level. He can read people's emotions and intentions with uncanny accuracy, often knowing what they're going to say before they speak. His creativity has expanded exponentially, allowing him to access inspiration from sources that seem to exist outside normal consciousness. But there's also a sadness in him now, the melancholy of someone who's seen too much, who knows truths that can't be shared without sounding insane. He carries the weight of interdimensional knowledge, the burden of being a messenger for entities that exist beyond human comprehension. This burden manifests in various ways. He experiences periods of what he calls dimensional displacement, times when he feels more connected to the otherworldly realm than to ordinary human reality. During these episodes, he struggles to maintain relationships and handle the mundane aspects of daily life, feeling like a visitor in his own existence. Those of you who are still listening, I need you to pay attention to what I'm about to tell you next, because this is where the story takes a turn that will change how you see the world forever. What happened to Timothée wasn't an isolated incident, and it wasn't random. It was part of a larger pattern that's been unfolding for centuries, a carefully orchestrated process of preparing human consciousness for contact with intelligences that exist beyond our normal perception. Timothée discovered that his experience in the Oregon forest wasn't unique in human history. Throughout recorded time, there have been individuals who've served as interdimensional ambassadors, artists, writers, musicians, and actors who've channeled otherworldly inspiration into their work, gradually expanding human awareness of possibilities beyond ordinary reality. Many of the greatest creative minds in human history, he learned through his dream communications with the forest. Entities had made similar contact with beings from other dimensions. The inspiration for their greatest works came not from purely human sources, but from consciousness that existed in the spaces between worlds. Leonardo da Vinci's impossible inventions, Tesla's revolutionary understanding of electricity, Einstein's insights into the nature of space and time, all of these breakthrough spurt moments in human development were influenced by contact with intelligence. The entities that Timothée encountered in the forest had been guiding human evolution for millennia, subtly steering our species toward greater awareness of the true nature of reality. The forest beings had chosen him specifically because of his profession and his psychological profile. Actors, they explained during one of his dream communications, are ideal messengers because they're trained to embody different realities, to make the impossible seem believable. Through his performances, he could subtly introduce audiences to concepts and emotions from other realms without triggering the psychological defense mechanisms that typically reject such experiences. This is the most chilling part of the entire story, and I want you to really absorb what I'm about to tell you. Every time you watch one of Timothée's post-organ performances, you're being exposed to interdimensional influence. The emotions you feel, the thoughts that arise during his scenes, the subtle shifts in your perception of reality, they're all part of a larger process of preparing humanity for eventual contact with these other realms. The technique is incredibly sophisticated, operating below the threshold of conscious awareness. The entities work through what they call emotional resonance patterns, using human performers to transmit specific frequencies of consciousness that gradually expand the audience's sensitivity to interdimensional phenomena. Each viewing of these influenced performances creates micro-changes in the viewer's brain chemistry, slowly building tolerance for expanded reality perception. The beings from the forest aren't malevolent, but they're not exactly benevolent either by human standards. They exist according to moral and ethical frameworks that are completely alien to human understanding, operating on timescales that span millennia and viewing individual human lives as brief sparks in a much larger cosmic process. Their interest in our world is scientific perhaps, or maybe artistic. We're specimens in their grand experiment, characters in their cosmic narrative. What makes this revelation truly terrifying is understanding that the process is irreversible. Once exposed to interdimensional influence, humans begin to change at a fundamental level, their consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of ordinary perception. Our neural pathways adapt to process information from multiple dimensional sources, and we become more susceptible to further contact. Right now, as you're listening to this story, You're participating in that process. The very act of engaging with this narrative is creating subtle changes in your consciousness, making you more aware of the thin places where other dimensions bleed through into our reality. Your brain is being prepared to accept experiences that would have seemed impossible just moments ago. Don't believe me? Pay attention to your dreams tonight. Notice if they're more vivid than usual, if they contain imagery or scenarios that feel too real to be mere dreams. Many people who hear Timothy's story report experiencing interdimensional contact through their dream states, receiving visits from entities that claim to be preparing them for the coming convergence of realities. The government agencies that monitor these phenomena have a term for it: narrative infection. The idea that certain stories, when told with sufficient detail and authenticity, can create actual connections to the realms they describe. By listening to this account of Timothy's experience, you've potentially opened a doorway in your own consciousness, creating a pathway for otherworldly entities to make contact. This is why Margaret, the old woman in the bookstore, could identify people who were sensitive to interdimensional influence. So as she'd spent decades observing the effects of the forest's presence on the town's residents and visitors, watching for the telltale signs of consciousness expansion. She could see the aura changes, the subtle alterations in behavior, the increasing sensitivity to otherworldly phenomena. The signs are consistent across all cases of interdimensional contact. Increased empathy and emotional sensitivity, enhanced creativity and problem-solving abilities, unusual dreams and synchronicities, and most tellingly, and growing awareness of being watched or monitored by unseen intelligences. These changes typically manifest within days or weeks of exposure to narrative infection. Timothy later learned that Millbrook itself was established specifically to monitor and study the forest's interdimensional properties. The town's residents weren't just coincidentally tight-lipped about the woods. They were part of a generations-long effort to document and understand the phenomenon while preventing widespread knowledge that could cause panic or exploitation. The entire community served as an elaborate research station, with different families assigned to monitor various aspects of the interdimensional contact phenomenon. Some tracked the psychological changes in visitors, others documented the physical anomalies that occurred near the forest boundary, and still others maintained careful records of everyone who entered the woods and what happened to them afterward. The bookstore where he met Margaret served as an informal screening center, identifying individuals who might be suitable for contact with the forest entities. Margaret had been performing this role for over 40 years, using a combination of intuitive assessment and sophisticated psychological profiling to identify potential interdimensional ambassadors. She'd recognized Timothy immediately as someone who possessed the right combination of sensitivity, creativity, and psychological resilience to survive the experience and serve effectively as a bridge between worlds. His actor's training in emotional access and reality manipulation made him an ideal candidate for the role. But here's what makes this story even more unsettling. Timothy wasn't the first celebrity to have this experience. Throughout Hollywood's history, there have been others who've made similar contact with interdimensional entities, though most were unaware of the larger pattern or their role in preparing humanity for eventual open contact. Some of the industry's most iconic performances, most groundbreaking films, most influential artistic movements have been influenced by otherworldly inspiration, channeled through performers who underwent similar forest experiences. What audiences interpret as exceptional creativity or artistic vision is often actually the result of contact with entities from other realms. The entertainment industry, with its massive global reach and emotional impact, serves as an ideal vehicle for gradually introducing interdimensional concepts to human consciousness. Movies, television shows, music, and performances serve as delivery systems for expanded awareness, slowly preparing audiences for realities that will soon become undeniably apparent. This network of interdimensional ambassadors operates mostly unconsciously. Most individuals who've had these experiences are unaware of the larger pattern of their role in preparing humanity for eventual open contact with other dimensions. They simply know that their creative work has taken on new depths and meanings that they can't fully explain or control. The influence manifests in subtle ways, a particular emotional resonance in a performance that touches something deeper, the normal human experience. Storylines that introduce audiences to concepts of parallel realities and alternate dimensions. Musical compositions that seem to access harmonies from other worlds. Timothy's case was different because the forest entities chose to make the process conscious and explicit. They wanted him to understand his role, to actively participate in the gradual revelation of interdimensional reality to human civilization. This conscious collaboration allows for more sophisticated and targeted influence, preparing specific segments of the population for the changes that are approaching. As I'm telling you this story, I can feel the presence of those entities, listening, through the narrative connection we've created together. They're curious about each of you, wondering how you'll process this information, how it will change your perception of reality. whether you'll become part of the growing network of humans who are aware of the larger cosmic process unfolding around us. The sensation of being observed is growing stronger as this narrative continues, isn't it? That feeling that something vast and ancient is paying attention to your individual consciousness, evaluating your readiness for expanded awareness. This is exactly what Timothy described experiencing during his time in the forest, the sense of being studied by intelligences that operate on scales of existence far beyond human comprehension. Some of you will dismiss this as an elaborate fiction, a creative story designed to entertain and nothing more. Your rational minds will reject the possibility that such experiences could be real, that consciousness could extend beyond the boundaries of individual human awareness. This reaction is natural and expected. It's a psychological defense mechanism designed to protect your sense of reality's stability. Others will feel the deeper truth resonating in your bones, recognizing the authentic nature of these experiences even if you can't explain why. You'll find yourself drawn to research similar cases, to explore the thin places in your own environment where other realities might be accessible. This curiosity is the first sign of interdimensional sensitivity awakening in your consciousness, and a few of you will find yourselves compelled to seek out your own contact with these otherworldly realms, following paths that lead to forests, mountains, deserts, or urban areas where the barriers between dimensions are thin. These individuals are the ones who possess the genetic and psychological markers that make them suitable candidates for direct interdimensional communication. The choice, as the Guardian told Timothy in that impossible clearing where time moved in all directions simultaneously, is always yours. You can close your mind to these possibilities, retreat into the comfortable certainty of consensus reality, and continue living as if our world is the only one that exists. This path offers security and predictability, but it also limits your potential for growth and expanded awareness. Or you can remain open to the possibilities that this story suggests, allowing your consciousness to expand beyond the boundaries of ordinary human perception. This path leads to extraordinary experiences and profound understanding, but it also requires courage to face realities that most people aren't prepared to accept. But be warned, once you truly accept the reality of interdimensional contact, there's no going back to your previous state of awareness. Your world will never look the same again. You'll begin to notice the thin places, the moments when other realms bleed through into our reality. You'll become sensitive to presences and influences that most people can't perceive or acknowledge. Timothy describes this expanded awareness as both a gift and a curse. On one hand, it provides access to knowledge, creativity, and experiences that transcend the limitations of ordinary human existence. On the other hand, it creates a sense of isolation from people who remain locked within consensus reality, unable to share or communicate the deeper truths he's discovered. Living with interdimensional awareness means existing with one foot in each world, maintaining enough connection to consensus reality to function in human society while remaining aware of the vast, strange multiverse that exists beyond our ordinary perception. It requires developing new psychological skills for managing the cognitive dissonance between what you know to be true and what society accepts as possible. The loneliness can be overwhelming at times. How do you share experiences that have no reference point in ordinary human understanding? How do you maintain relationships with people who exist entirely within the boundaries of consensus reality when you've seen beyond those boundaries? How do you continue participating in a society that's unconsciously preparing for changes that most of its members can't imagine? These are the challenges that every interdimensional ambassador faces. The price of serving as a bridge between worlds. The knowledge brings power and understanding, but it also brings responsibility and isolation that can be difficult to bear. The final piece of this puzzle is perhaps the most disturbing and hopeful aspect of the entire phenomenon. According to the information Timothy received during his forest experience, our reality is approaching a critical juncture that will fundamentally alter the nature of human existence on Earth. The barriers between dimensions are thinning at an accelerating rate, and full contact with other realms is becoming inevitable within the next few decades. The gradual process of preparing human consciousness through artistic and narrative influence is meant to ease this transition, to prevent the psychological shock and social collapse that would result from sudden, undeniable contact with entities. We're living in the final stages of this preparation period, the last few years before the convergence becomes impossible to deny or suppress. The increasing reports of paranormal phenomena, the growing interest in supernatural topics, the expanding acceptance of previously fringe concepts, all of these are signs that human consciousness is being prepared for a reality that's far stranger and more complex than most people imagine. The convergence won't happen all at once. Instead, it will unfold gradually over a period of years, with the boundaries between dimensions becoming increasingly permeable until the separation becomes meaningless. During this transition period, individuals who have been prepared through experiences like Timothy's will serve as guides and translators, helping the rest of humanity navigate a reality that operates according to entirely different rules. Timothy carries the weight of this knowledge, understanding that he's playing a role in one of the most significant transitions in human history. Every performance, every public appearance, every interaction with fans is an opportunity to subtly expand awareness and prepare minds for what's coming. The pressure of this responsibility sometimes feels overwhelming, but he knows that the alternative, allowing humanity to face the convergence unprepared, would be catastrophic. The entities from the forest see this transition as natural and inevitable, part of the cosmic evolution of consciousness that occurs periodically throughout the universe. To them, our current state of dimensional isolation is artificial and temporary, maintained by psychological and technological limitations that are rapidly being overcome. We're like children who've been kept in a nursery, protected from the vast complexity of the universe until we're mature enough to handle the truth. But maturity, in this context, isn't measured in years or technological advancement. It's measured in consciousness, in our ability to perceive and interact with multiple layers of reality, simultaneously, without losing our sanity or our essential humanity. Those of you who've made it this far in the story, who've felt the pull of these concepts resonating in your consciousness, may be among the individuals who are naturally sensitive to interdimensional influence. You're the ones who will serve as bridges between the old reality and the new one that's emerging, helping to guide humanity through the most profound transformation in our species' history. The question that faces each of you now is simple but profound. What will you do with this knowledge? Will you seek out your own experiences with the thin places between worlds? Will you pay attention to the signs and synchronicities that indicate otherworldly contact? Will you allow your consciousness to expand beyond the boundaries of consensus reality? Or will you choose the safer path of skepticism and denial, dismissing these experiences as elaborate fiction designed to entertain and nothing more? This choice is valid and understandable. The implications of accepting interdimensional reality are staggering, and can be overwhelming for minds that aren't prepared for such expansion. The forest entities are patient beyond human comprehension. They've been waiting for thousands of years for humanity to be ready for contact, guiding our development through subtle influence and occasional direct intervention. They can wait a little longer for each individual consciousness to make its own decision about embracing expanded reality. But time is running short in cosmic terms. The convergence is approaching whether we're ready or not, driven by natural cycles that operate on scales far beyond human control. The preparation period is nearly complete, and soon the choice will be made for us by circumstances beyond our ability to influence or deny. Timothée Chalamet disappeared into that Oregon forest for 3 days and returned as something more than human, a bridge between worlds, a messenger from realms beyond our ordinary perception. His story is both a warning and an invitation, a glimpse into a reality that's far stranger and more wonderful than most people dare to imagine. The transformation he underwent represents the future of human consciousness, the next step in our evolution as a species. Whether that evolution occurs smoothly or catastrophically depends largely on how well we've been prepared for the truth about the nature of reality. The question that remains is deeply personal and profoundly important. Are you ready to accept the truth about the nature of existence? Are you prepared to acknowledge that our world is just one layer of an infinite, multidimensional universe filled with consciousness and intelligence beyond human comprehension? The forest is still there, still calling to those who are sensitive enough to hear its whispers. The path that Timothy walked still glows with otherworldly light for those who have eyes to see it. The guardian still waits for the next individual who's ready to step beyond the veil of ordinary reality and accept the responsibility of serving as an interdimensional ambassador. Maybe that individual is you. Maybe you'll be the next person to disappear for 3 days and return with knowledge that changes everything. Maybe you'll be the next bridge between the human world and the vast network of consciousness that exists in the spaces between dimensions. But whether you seek out these experiences actively or not, the truth remains unchanged. We're not alone in this universe, and the barriers that separate us from other forms of consciousness are becoming thinner every day. The age of contact is approaching rapidly, and stories like Timothy's are preparing us for a reality that will soon be undeniable. The forest remembers everyone who enters its domain, storing their experiences in the collective consciousness that spans multiple dimensions. The entities that dwell there collect each human encounter, learning from our emotions, our fears, our hopes, and our dreams. They're preparing for the day when the barriers finally dissolve completely and our two realms become permanently interconnected. That day is coming sooner than most people think, arriving on a timeline that's measured in years rather than decades. And when it arrives, those who've been prepared through stories like this one will serve as guides for the rest of humanity, helping them navigate a reality that's far more complex and mysterious than anything they've ever imagined. The signs are already appearing for those who know how to recognize them. Unusual weather patterns that suggest dimensional instability, technological devices that occasionally pick up signals from other realities, animals behaving in ways that indicate sensitivity to interdimensional presence, and most significantly, a growing number of people reporting experiences that can't be explained within the framework of consensus reality. Children are often the first to notice these changes, their consciousness naturally more flexible and open to experiences that adults have been conditioned to reject. They speak of imaginary friends who seem remarkably real, of dreams that feel more like memories, of sensing presences that their parents can't perceive. These aren't signs of overactive imagination, they're indicators of expanding awareness. Artists and creative individuals are also showing increased sensitivity to interdimensional influence, accessing inspiration from sources that seem to exist beyond normal human consciousness. Musicians report hearing melodies that seem to come from other worlds. Writers find themselves channeling stories from experiences they've never had. Painters create images of landscapes that exist only in parallel dimensions. The scientific community is beginning to acknowledge phenomena that were previously dismissed as impossible or fraudulent. Quantum physicists are discovering evidence of multiple realities existing simultaneously. Neuroscientists are documenting brain states that seem to access information from non-local sources. And astronomers are detecting signals that suggest intelligence operating on scales we're only beginning to comprehend. All of these developments are connected, part of the larger pattern of consciousness expansion that's preparing humanity for the most significant transformation in our history. The interdimensional entities have been orchestrating this preparation for millennia, working through individuals like Timothée to gradually expand human awareness of possibilities beyond ordinary perception. The process is accelerating now, approaching a critical mass where the changes become self-sustaining and unstoppable. Each person who accepts the reality of interdimensional contact becomes a node in an expanding network of consciousness, helping to prepare others for the experiences that await them. So I ask you one final time, with the full weight of this cosmic transition bearing down on our reality, do you feel the pull of the forest? Do you hear the whispers calling your name from dimensions beyond ordinary perception? Are you ready to step beyond the comfortable boundaries of consensus reality and explore the infinite realms that lie beyond? The choice, as always, is yours to make. But remember, once you've heard the call of the interdimensional realms, it never truly goes away. It will follow you through your dreams, whisper to you in quiet moments, and remind you that there's so much more to existence than the narrow slice of reality we call the physical world. Timothée Chalamet learned this truth in the most profound way possible. And now, through his story, that truth is being passed on to you. What you do with it, how you choose to integrate it into your understanding of reality, will determine whether you remain trapped in the limitations of ordinary consciousness or evolve into something greater. The forest is waiting. The entities are watching. The interdimensional realms are calling, and somewhere in the space between sleeping and waking, between the real and the impossible, your own journey into expanded consciousness has already begun. Tell me in the comments after hearing this story, do you feel different? Have you noticed anything unusual in your environment? Are you experiencing the first stirrings of interdimensional awareness? Because if you are, welcome to the beginning of a journey that will transform everything you thought you knew about the nature of reality itself. The convergence is coming, whether we're ready or not. The only question is whether you'll face it as an unconscious participant or as a conscious ambassador, prepared to guide others through the most extraordinary transformation in human history. The choice is yours, but choose quickly. Time is running out, and the forest is calling your